My parents said they sacrificed everything for me, but I never asked them to. They say the love of a parent is unconditional, but in my house, love always came with a receipt. My name is Liam, and I am 28 years old. For as long as I can remember, my life was not entirely my own. It was a purchased item, paid for in full by the people who brought me into this world, and the price was my gratitude. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside, manicured lawns and beige walls, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of unspoken debts. My parents were not abusive in the way the law defines it. There were no raised fists or cruel insults hurled at my character. Instead, their weapon of choice was a subtle, suffocating narrative of martyrdom. They had sacrificed everything for me, and because of that, my existence was a contract I had to honor every single day. The narrative began before I could even speak. It was woven into the bedtime stories my mother told, not about heroes and dragons, but about the hardships she endured to carry me for 9 months. I learned early on that her back pain was my fault, that the stretch marks on her stomach were a monument to my selfishness, and that the career she gave up was a direct casualty of my birth. As a small boy, I didn't have the capacity to question this logic. I simply accepted it as the truth of the universe. I was a burden, a heavy, expensive creature that required their constant suffering to maintain. When I started school, the dynamic shifted from physical sacrifice to financial investment. My father, who worked a job he claimed to despise, would sit me down at the kitchen table with the bills spread out like a deck of cards. He would point to the numbers, the mortgage, the electricity, the groceries, and explain in a somber tone that these things existed only because of me. If it weren't for me, he would be traveling the world or living in a cabin in the woods. Instead, he was trapped in a cubicle, selling hours of his life to pay for my braces and my baseball camps. I remember staring at the numbers, feeling a hot knot of guilt tighten in my chest. I didn't ask for braces. I didn't ask for summer camps. But I learned that wanting things was a moral failing that caused my parents pain. This guilt became the primary filter through which I viewed the world. Every meal I ate was a reminder of the money they spent. Every new pair of sneakers felt like a theft from their happiness. I became a kid who apologized for breathing, who tried to take up as little space as possible. I stopped asking for things, even the necessities, because the look of disappointment on their faces when they had to open their wallets was worse than going without. I thought that if I could just be perfect, if I could be grateful enough, the ledger would eventually balance. I thought I could pay off the debt of my existence by being the perfect son. But the problem with a debt that is based on existence is that it can never be repaid. The more I try to please them, the more they raise the price. And on a report card wasn't an achievement. It was the bare minimum return on their investment. A clean room wasn't helpfulness. It was basic maintenance for the roof they provided. I was trapped in a cycle of earning my keep, terrified that if I slipped up, they would realize I wasn't worth the cost and abandon me. By the time I reached my teenage years, the guilt had moved into my bones. It was no longer just about money. It was about their happiness. I was solely responsible for their emotional well-being, a heavy burden for a boy who was just trying to figure out who he was. The turning point came when I started thinking about college. For the first time, I saw a flicker of light at the end of the tunnel, a chance to escape the heavy atmosphere of the house and become something separate from them. But I quickly learned that distance didn't mean freedom. The strings attached to my life were longer and stronger than I ever could have imagined. As I filled out applications, my parents hovered over my shoulder, not with pride, but with calculation. They weren't interested in what I wanted to study or where I felt at home. They were interested in the return on investment. My dreams were secondary to the narrative of their sacrifice. I was preparing to leave, but I was taking the prison with me. The transition to university was supposed to be a liberation, a physical severing of the umbilical cord that had been choking me for 18 years. I packed my bags with a mix of exhilaration and dread, moving into a dorm room 3 hours away from the house that felt like a museum of my mother's regret. For the first few weeks, the air tasted different. It was crisp and free, untainted by the heavy sighs of disappointment or the constant tallying of favors. I walked to classes without feeling the need to apologize for the sidewalk under my feet. I made friends who didn't look at me as if I owed them a check. For a brief, shining moment, I thought I had escaped. However, the illusion of freedom shattered the first time my phone rang. It was my mother, and the sound of her voice immediately transported me back to that kitchen table. She didn't ask how I was settling in or if I had made friends. She launched immediately into a monologue about how quiet the house was, how she had cried herself to sleep the night before, and how my father was working overtime to cover the tuition that she described as eye-watering. She didn't say it explicitly, but the message was clear. My happiness was directly causing her misery. Every dollar spent on my textbooks was a dollar taken from her peace of mind. I began to realize that the guilt wasn't just a feeling. It was a mechanism of control. It was a finely tuned instrument they had perfected over years. Even from miles away, they could pull the strings and make me dance. I stopped going out with friends on weekends because I felt too guilty spending money on pizza or movies, knowing my parents were sacrificing back home. I isolated myself in the library, studying not because I wanted to learn, but because I feared failure. If I failed a class, the investment would go bust, and I couldn't bear the thought of being a failed asset. During my sophomore year, the pressure intensified. I had declared a major in graphic design, a subject that fascinated me. I wanted to create, to build things with my hands and my mind. But when I broke the news during a rare visit home, the reaction was catastrophic. My parents didn't see design as a career. They saw it as a hobby that wouldn't pay dividends. My father slammed his hand on the table, not in anger, but in a dramatic display of despair. He ranted about how he had wasted his youth in a factory so I could draw pictures. My mother wept silently, wiping her eyes with a napkin, performing her role as the tragic martyr. The message was unmistakable. My dreams were frivolous. Their sacrifice was sacred. To pursue what I loved was to spit on their graves while they were still alive. I spent the rest of the weekend in a fog of anxiety, feeling the walls closing in. I realized that my education wasn't about my future. It was about theirs. They were living vicariously through me, and they expected a specific outcome to justify the pain they claimed to have endured. By the time I drove back to campus on Sunday evening, I had withdrawn from my design classes and enrolled in finance courses. It felt like a death, a small, quiet death of the person I was trying to become. I excelled in finance, of course. I had been trained since birth to be compliant and to execute orders efficiently. I got straight A's, joined relevant clubs, and secured high-paying internships. My professors praised my work ethic. My parents finally sounded proud of me during our weekly calls. But inside, I felt hollow. I was building a life I didn't want, following a map I hadn't drawn. Every success felt like a betrayal of myself, and every compliment from my parents felt like a receipt being stamped paid in full, even though the balance never went down. I was becoming exactly what they wanted, a high-earning mirror reflecting their own glory. The years passed in a blur of corporate events and suit-and-tie interviews. I graduated at the top of my class, and my parents beamed at the ceremony, taking credit for every accolade. They told anyone who would listen how they had scraped and saved to make this moment possible. They didn't mention the tears, the anxiety attacks, or the suppressed dreams. As I stood on that stage, holding my diploma, I didn't feel joy. I felt a terrifying realization that the script had been written for me, and I had merely memorized the lines. I was 22 years old, and I had no idea who Liam was when he wasn't apologizing for existing. Entering the workforce was the natural progression of the life my parents had designed for me. With my finance degree and a resume packed with prestigious internships, I landed a job at a top-tier investment bank in the city. The salary was exorbitant for a 22-year-old, more money than I had ever seen in my life. To an outsider, I was the picture of success. I had a corner office with a view of the skyline, designer suits, and a bustling social life that revolved around networking events and expensive steakhouses. I had achieved everything my parents had ever dreamed of, and in doing so, I had purchased their silence. For the first year, the calls were less frequent, or at least less hostile. My mother would ask about my bonus, and my father would brag to his friends about my position. The guilt seemed to have transformed into a transaction. I was now the provider, the one who had justified their investment. I sent money home every month, a portion of my paycheck that was essentially rent for my childhood. I paid off their car loan and renovated their kitchen. I thought that if I gave them enough financial security, the emotional debt would finally be cleared. I thought I could buy my freedom. But the nature of a black hole is that it consumes everything around it, and my parents' need for control was a black hole. The money didn't satisfy them. It just empowered them. They began to view me as a resource to be mined. My mother would drop hints about wanting a vacation she couldn't afford, and I would book it for her. My father would mention needing a new truck, and the check would be in the mail by the weekend. I was working 80 hours a week, drowning in stress, to fund a lifestyle that allowed them to continue their narrative of martyrdom. Even with my help, they still complained. They complained about the flight delays on the vacations I paid for. They complained about the color of the truck. The isolation of my corporate life began to mirror the isolation of my childhood. I was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. My colleagues were competitive and driven, but they seemed to be fueled by ambition, not fear. I watched them celebrate promotions and plan their futures, realizing that they were living for themselves, while I was living in service to a memory of debt. I had no hobbies. I had no romantic relationships because I couldn't imagine subjecting another person to the scrutiny of my parents, nor did I have the emotional bandwidth to care for anyone else when I was constantly trying to appease two people who could never be appeased. The breaking point wasn't a single dramatic event, but rather the slow accumulation of small, suffocating moments. It happened on a Tuesday evening. I was in my office, the city lights flickering below me, staring at a spreadsheet that didn't make sense. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother containing a photo of a broken window. The message read, "The wind did this. We are freezing. I don't know how we'll manage." I looked at the photo. It was a minor crack, easily fixable for a few $100s. But the implication was clear. Asterisk, your father and I are suffering. It is your job to fix it. Asterisk, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I was exhausted. I hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in a week. I was making more money than I knew what to do with. Yet I felt poor because every cent was already claimed by their expectations. I realized that no matter how much I gave, they would always find a way to need more. They didn't want a son. They wanted a benefactor and a scapegoat. They needed me to struggle so that their sacrifice remained relevant. If I were happy and thriving without their help, their entire identity would crumble. That night, I didn't reply to the text. I turned off my phone and sat in the dark office, letting the silence wash over me. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty about my silence. I felt a spark of anger. It was a small, dangerous flame, but it was there. I thought about all the years I had apologized for my needs, all the dreams I had buried to keep them happy. I thought about the career path I loathed and the money I was funneling into a bottomless pit. I realized that I was 25 years old, and I was still trying to earn the love that should have been free. The anger grew, fueling a sudden clarity. I stood up, gathered my things, and walked out of the office, leaving my laptop open on the desk. I went to my apartment and packed a bag. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed a space where the air wasn't thick with the weight of their expectations. I booked a last-minute flight to a small coastal town I had visited as a child, a place where the ocean roared louder than the voices in my head. I was running away, yes, but for the first time, I wasn't running to fix a problem for them. I was running to save myself. The coastal town was a world away from the glass towers of the city. It was quiet, salty, and rhythmically slow. I spent the first few days in a daze, sleeping on the balcony of a small rental cottage, listening to the waves crash against the shore. The silence was deafening at first. My brain was so accustomed to the constant hum of anxiety and the mental checklist of things I needed to do for my parents that the quiet felt wrong. It felt like I was skipping class, like I was going to get in trouble. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification from work or a text from my mother, my heart rate spiked. But as the days turned into a week, the fog began to lift. I stopped checking my work email. I let the calls from my parents go to voicemail. I didn't book the flight home, and I didn't send money to fix the window. For the first time in my life, I wasn't doing anything productive. I wasn't earning, I wasn't pleasing, and I wasn't sacrificing. I was just existing. It was terrifying. I felt a physical phantom pain, a withdrawal from the dopamine hit of being a good son. I waited for the sky to fall. I waited for the world to punish me for my selfishness. But the sky didn't fall. The sun continued to rise and set. The ocean continued to breathe. The locals in the town didn't know my GPA or my salary. They just smiled and nodded when I walked past. It was a startling revelation. The world did not revolve around my parents' narrative. I was a speck of dust in the grand scheme of things, and that was liberating. My mother's melodrama was not a global crisis. My father's disappointment was not a seismic event. They were just two people with their own issues, and I was the victim they had used to work through those issues. One afternoon, I found a stack of old magazines in the cottage. I sat on the floor and flipped through them, seeing images of people living lives that were messy and imperfect. I realized that I had been raised to believe that perfection was the minimum standard to avoid guilt. If I wasn't perfect, I was ungrateful. But here, in this dusty cottage, I was far from perfect. I was a corporate dropout, ignoring his responsibilities. Yet, I felt more alive than I had in years. I felt like I was finally meeting the person I had buried under years of compliance. The unraveling of my old life began in earnest when I finally called my boss. I expected screaming, demands, or threats. Instead, the voice on the other end was tired and bureaucratic. I resigned. I didn't give a 2-week notice. I just said I wasn't coming back. The finality of it sent a shiver down my spine. I severed the career tie that had justified my parents' sacrifice. I was no longer a high-paid analyst. I was just Liam, unemployed and sitting on a wooden floor. Then came the inevitable confrontation with my parents. I couldn't hide forever. I turned my phone on to dozens of frantic messages. I finally picked up. My mother didn't ask if I was okay. She demanded to know where the money for the window was. She asked why I wasn't at work. When I told her I had quit, silence filled the line. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the sound of a volcano preparing to erupt. Then came the accusations. They came fast and hot. I was ungrateful. I was throwing my life away. I was ruining them. After everything they had done, this was how I repaid them. I listened, holding the phone away from my ear, watching a seagull fight with a piece of bread on the railing. The words that used to cut me to the bone now sounded like static. I recognized the pattern. It was the same script they had used since I was a child. It was the weaponization of guilt to force me back into line. But this time, I didn't apologize. I didn't promise to fix it. I didn't cry. When she finally stopped to take a breath, I spoke calmly. I told her I was taking some time for myself. I told her I wouldn't be sending money for a while. I told her I was sorry they felt that way, but I hung up before she could respond. The aftermath was a mix of panic and relief. I knew the storm was coming. I knew they would pull out all the stops to drag me back. Emotional blackmail, perhaps threats of disownment, or playing the victim card to our extended family. But sitting there in the cottage, watching the sunset, I realized I was stronger than their guilt. The unraveling wasn't the end of the world. It was the beginning of the cleanup. I had torn down the house of cards they had built, and for the first time, I could see the land beneath it. It was rocky and uncertain, but it was mine. Staying in the cottage was a temporary reprieve, but I couldn't hide forever. My savings were substantial, thanks to my years of high-earning servitude, so I wasn't worried about money in the short term. I decided to rent a small apartment in a mid-sized city, a place where nobody knew me and I could rebuild my personality from scratch. But before I could move forward, I had to understand how I had gotten here. The anger I felt toward my parents was real, but beneath the anger was a confusion that I needed to resolve. Was I really the villain in their story? Had I imagined the weight of their expectations? I decided to go back to my hometown, not to stay with them, but to see an old uncle, my father's younger brother, Uncle Thomas. Uncle Thomas had always been the black sheep of the family, a man who worked with his hands and lived in a cabin, much to my father's disdain. I met him in a noisy diner, his eyes twinkling with a knowing warmth as I sat down. I didn't hold back. I poured out the whole story. The sacrifices, the guilt, the career I hated, the money I gave, and the feeling that I owed them my life because I hadn't asked to be born. Uncle Thomas listened, his face growing serious. When I finished, he let out a long sigh and reached across the table to pat my hand. He told me something that shifted the foundation of my reality. He said, "Liam, your parents were unhappy long before you were born." He went on to describe their youth. My father hadn't given up a thriving career. He had been fired from a series of jobs due to his temper. My mother hadn't been a budding professional force to put down her tools. She had simply hated working and always dreamed of being taken care of. The sacrifices were myths they had told themselves to justify their resentment. They hadn't sacrificed their happiness for me. They had used me as a scapegoat for their own failures to launch the lives they wanted. Every time my mother complained about giving up her career, it wasn't because she missed the work. It was because she didn't want to admit she preferred being a housewife, but also wanted to be admired for it. They needed a villain in their story to explain why they weren't happier. And since they couldn't blame themselves, they blamed the expense and responsibility of raising a child. Hearing this was like taking a blindfold off. I remembered the poor room in our house where my father would sit and brood, claiming to be calculating bills. I realized now he was just wallowing in his own inertia. The guilt I had carried for 28 years, the guilt of being a financial burden, of being the reason they didn't travel or buy nice things, was based on a lie. They didn't do those things because they didn't want to, or because they were irresponsible with money, or simply because that wasn't who they were. I was just the convenient excuse. Armed with this new perspective, I went to the family home one last time while they were out to collect a few personal items I had left behind. I walked through the rooms with different eyes. I looked at the photos on the walls. There were very few of us actually having fun. They were all staged, with me smiling stiffly and my parents looking like martyrs. I found my old journals in the basement. Reading them was painful. Page after page was filled with apologies to God and my parents for being a burden. "I will try to be better," I had written at age 10. "I will make them proud," I had written at 16. I sat on the floor of my old bedroom and cried. But they weren't tears of guilt. They were tears of grief. I was grieving the childhood I didn't have. I was grieving the relationship I thought I had, which was actually just a business transaction. I was mourning the years I had spent hating myself for a debt that was fabricated. I realized that my parents' love wasn't conditional on my behavior. It was conditional on my utility to their narrative. As long as I played the role of the grateful recipient of their sacrifice, they loved me. The moment I stepped out of that role, I became the enemy. It was a bitter pill to swallow, accepting that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had viewed me as an extension of their own ego. But as I packed my box of keepsakes, leaving the guilt journals behind on the shelf, I felt a profound sense of lightness. The truth, no matter how painful, was lighter than the lie. I wasn't a bad son. I wasn't an ungrateful leech. I was just a person who had been used to prop up someone else's unhappiness. And that chapter was finally closing. Moving into my own apartment was the act of claiming a territory that was solely mine. It wasn't a dorm room paid for by them, and it wasn't a high-rise condo fueled by my corporate salary to fund them. It was a modest two-bedroom walk-up. I painted the walls a dark slate gray, a color my mother always hated because it made rooms look like a dungeon. To me, it looked like a storm cloud, like strength, like safety. I bought furniture secondhand, not out of necessity, but because I wanted to build a home that didn't feel like a showroom for perfection. The hardest part of this new life was establishing contact with my parents. I knew I couldn't just disappear forever without causing myself more psychological damage, nor did I want to be the kind of person who severed ties without explanation. I needed to set boundaries, a concept that was entirely foreign to our family dynamic. Boundaries were treated as insults in our house. To say no was to say, "I don't love you." But I was learning that love could exist without the surrender of one's soul. I arranged to meet them for lunch in a neutral location, a busy restaurant in the city where I now lived. The noise would act as a buffer, preventing a scene. When I walked in, I saw them immediately. They looked older, smaller than I remembered. They were scanning the room with anxious expressions, looking for the son they controlled, not the man I had become. When I sat down, my mother immediately started in on the monologue she had been rehearsing. She talked about the neighbors, the broken window, the shame of my resignation, all without taking a breath. I let her finish her coffee. I didn't interrupt. I didn't apologize. I just watched her mouth move, realizing that this was a performance she had been perfecting for decades. When she finally stopped, I spoke. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply stated my reality. I told them that I loved them, but I would no longer be participating in the narrative of their sacrifice. I told them that I would not be paying for their renovations or their vacations anymore. I told them that my career choices were mine to make, and my happiness was not an insult to theirs. The reaction was instantaneous. My father turned red. My mother began to cry, big, theatrical tears. After everything, she whispered, her voice trembling. It was the guilt gun, loaded and cocked. But I had dismantled the ammunition. I looked at her and said, I know you feel you sacrificed a lot, but I never asked you to, and I am done paying for a debt I didn't sign up for. It was the hardest thing I had ever said. It felt like tearing my own skin off. But as the words hung in the air between us, I felt stronger. They tried to argue. They tried to list every penny they had spent, every meal they had cooked. I sat there, unmoved, realizing that their anger was actually fear. They were terrified of losing their scapegoat. They were terrified of facing a life where they couldn't blame me for their choices. I paid the bill for lunch, a final gesture of charity, not obligation, and I left. They sat there, stunned, watching me walk away. I didn't look back. I didn't wait for them to forgive me. I didn't need their forgiveness anymore. In the weeks that followed, the emails and texts were relentless. They oscillated between rage and pity, trying every button they had installed in me over the years. They told extended family I was having a breakdown. They sent me long articles about the duty of sons to aging parents. I read them all, and then I blocked their numbers. It wasn't out of hate. It was out of preservation. I was in the early stages of healing a wound that had been festering for a lifetime, and I couldn't let the same people who caused the injury perform the surgery. The silence that followed the blocking was the loudest thing I had ever heard. My apartment was quiet. My phone was still. At first, the silence was terrifying. I felt like I was floating in space with no tether. But slowly, the silence became a canvas. I started filling it with things I actually enjoyed. I took a woodworking class. I read books that had nothing to do with finance. I made coffee in the morning and drank it while staring out the window, doing absolutely nothing. I was learning how to be a man who existed just for the sake of existing. It was a slow, messy process, but it was mine. It has been 2 years since I walked out of that glass office and 3 years since I sat across from my parents in that restaurant and declared my independence. The life I live now is unrecognizable to the boy who once calculated his worth in parental approval. I work at a small nonprofit now, making a fraction of my previous salary. I help at-risk youth navigate the education system, a job that requires empathy and connection, things I had to relearn after years of emotional suppression. I don't drive a luxury car, and I don't wear Italian suits. I live simply, but for the first time, I live richly. The relationship with my parents is distant. We exchange emails once a month, usually brief updates about the weather or health. They have stopped asking for money, mostly because they realize that asking leads to silence. They still try to slip in the occasional guilt trip, mentioning how cold the house is or how hard it is to be old, but the words bounce off me now. I read them with a detachment that surprises even me. I send a card for birthdays and holidays. I am polite, I am kind, but I am no longer theirs to mold. I am a guest in their lives, not a prop. Healing from guilt-based parenting is not a straight line. There are days, even now, when I feel a sudden pang of anxiety after buying something unnecessary, like a new set of tools or a vintage watch. I hear my mother's voice in the back of my head, asking if I really need it. But now, I know how to answer that voice. I tell myself that I work hard, that my money is mine, and that I deserve small joys. It takes a few deep breaths, but the anxiety passes. The conditioning is deep, but my will to be free is deeper. I also realize now that the narrative of the sacrificial parent is a common tragedy. I see it in my friends, in the way they talk about their own families, the way they feel unable to say no. We are a generation raised on the idea that we owe our parents our lives, but we are slowly unlearning that toxic lesson. We are realizing that the cycle of debt ends with us. I no longer view my birth as a burden I placed on them. I view my birth as a neutral biological event that they chose to interpret as a tragedy. That interpretation was their choice, not my responsibility. I sometimes wonder what my life would have been like if I had stayed on that original path. I would probably be a vice president at the bank by now, miserable, divorced perhaps, still writing checks to fund a lifestyle that never satisfied them. I would be a martyr too, just like them, complaining to anyone who would listen about how I gave up my dreams for my family. It's a ghost life, a shadow of what could have been, and I am grateful every day that I stepped off the moving walkway. The final realization, the one that truly set me free, was understanding that you cannot repay a gift that was given with strings attached by simply pulling the strings tighter. The only way to break the cycle is to cut the cord entirely. I had to let them be disappointed in me. I had to let them think I am ungrateful. I had to accept that they might never truly know who I am, because knowing me would require them to admit their own flaws. And that is a price they are unwilling to pay. I sit in my gray-walled apartment now, the morning sun streaming in, holding a cup of coffee. The air is light. The ledger is gone. There is no debt collector knocking at the door of my mind. I am Liam, 28 years old, and I never asked them to sacrifice everything for me. But now, I have finally sacrificed the guilt to save myself. And that is a trade I would make every single time. The story is no longer about what they gave up. It is about what I have finally gained. The right to my own life